The men in the center of the Roman line couldn't breathe. Not because of fear, not because of wounds. Because there was no room left in the world to draw a breath. Their own army had compressed around them so completely that soldiers died standing upright, held in place by the press of bodies, with nowhere to fall. August 2nd, 216 BC. The Roman Republic had assembled the largest army in its history, approximately 86,000 men, nearly double Hannibal's force. They had marched to this flat Apulian plain specifically to end the invasion that had already destroyed 2 Roman armies in less than 2 years. Both Polybius and Livy, writing from different sources and different centuries, agree on what happened next. By nightfall, somewhere between 47,000 and 70,000 of those Romans were dead, killed in a single afternoon on a field barely a mile wide. So what did Hannibal do with 50,000 soldiers against 86,000 Romans? He let them win, for exactly long enough to destroy them. But here's what military historians have never fully resolved. When the killing stopped, Hannibal did nothing. According to Livy, his cavalry commander begged him to ride immediately for Rome. The road was open, the city nearly defenseless, victory 5 days away. And Hannibal, who had just executed the most geometrically perfect annihilation in military history, said no. This was a man who had crossed the Alps with war elephants, who had planned 3 consecutive Roman army destructions in meticulous detail. Something shifted at Cannae, not in his tactics, but in the space between victory and its purpose. The chronicles record the refusal. They don't fully explain it. The men who survived Cannae were stripped of their civil rights and exiled to Sicily in disgrace. And those same disgraced soldiers became the hardened core of the army that finally defeated Hannibal 16 years later. Hannibal's most devastating weapon wasn't his cavalry or his infantry. It was the Roman formation itself, which he had specifically designed his entire trap to exploit. And a German field marshal studied this battle so obsessively that he titled his entire operational doctrine after it. And his attempt to replicate Cannae on a continental scale in 1914 killed millions and failed anyway. To understand why a man who just annihilated Rome's finest army refused to finish the job, we need to go back to 237 BC, and the moment a 9-year-old boy stood before a sacrificial altar and swore an oath that would, in time, kill 100,000 people. Picture a child of 9 standing before a sacrificial altar in Carthage, watching the priests prepare the offering and asking his father one question: "Can I come?" Hannibal Barca was preparing to leave for Spain, where Carthage needed to rebuild the empire it had lost. The First Punic War had ended in 241 BC with Carthaginian humiliation. Sicily stripped away, then Sardinia and Corsica seized by Rome, while Carthage was distracted by a mercenary revolt that nearly destroyed the state entirely. Hamilcar had spent a decade trying to rebuild what Rome had taken, and now he was heading west to do it properly. His son wanted to go with him. According to Livy and Cornelius Nepos, 2 of the ancient world's most important biographical sources, Hamilcar agreed to the request on one condition: the boy must swear before the gods eternal enmity to Rome. Hannibal swore. Polybius, generally the more reliable of the ancient historians, does not record this specific scene in his surviving text. And modern scholars note it may have been embellished through generations of retelling. What no historian disputes is the outcome. Hannibal spent the next 38 years in its fulfillment. The family name already carried weight enough. Barca, their surname, was a Semitic cognomen meaning lightning or thunderbolt, earned by Hamilcar for the speed and ferocity of his attacks during the First Punic War. In his own Punic language, Hannibal's name meant mercy of Baal. The combination, mercy and lightning, carried by a child raised on a frontier of conquest and bitterness, produced something the ancient world had not prepared for. Hamilcar died in 228 BC, killed in an ambush while reportedly holding a position long enough to allow his 3 sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Magu, to escape. Command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Handsome, who extended Carthaginian power northward to the Ebro River and founded New Carthage, the city the Romans would later call Carthago Nova, on the southeastern Spanish coast. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army in Spain made its choice instantly. They proclaimed Hannibal commander-in-chief by acclamation. He was 26 years old. The Carthaginian government ratified the appointment. Livy's portrait of the young Hannibal, drawing on the observations of soldiers who had served under his father, describes a man who seemed to older veterans like a Hamilcar reborn. The same quality of attention, the same combination of audacity and calculation. What Livy adds from his own assessment, and here Roman bias must be acknowledged, since Livy was writing for a Roman audience, were vices to match the virtues: cruelty, treachery, no regard for truth. Most modern historians read the vice list as propaganda. The virtues they find harder to dismiss. What Polybius documents separately is more useful for understanding the general who would fight at Cannae. He notes a violent temper alongside extraordinary physical endurance. Hannibal shared soldiers' food, slept on the ground wrapped in his military cloak, and could endure extremes of heat and cold that broke men around him. More remarkably, the History Herald's biographical analysis notes that across 16 years of campaigning in Italy, often without pay for his mercenaries, living off an enemy's countryside, Hannibal never once experienced mutiny or rebellion. That fact requires explanation, and the explanation is personal. His men believed, with everything they had seen, that he was worth following. He also fought with one eye. Polybius records that during the crossing of the flooded Arno marshes in 217 BC, Hannibal developed severe conjunctivitis, ophthalmia, and lost the sight of his right eye. He commanded the greatest cavalry army the ancient world had ever assembled while functionally blind on one side. The chronicles mention it almost in passing. They do not treat it as extraordinary. Perhaps by then, nothing Hannibal did seemed extraordinary anymore. He was 26 when he took command. He was 29 when he crossed the Alps. He was 31 when he stood on the plain at Cannae. Every battle he fought before that plain was, in retrospect, preparation for what he was building toward. A trap so geometrically precise that it would not require improvisation, only patience, and the certainty that Rome would do exactly what Rome always did. By the time Rome raised its largest army in history, it had already buried the equivalent of 8 consular armies. Dickinson College commentaries, analyzing the accumulated casualty figures from Polybius and Livy, calculates that in just 20 months of Italian campaigning, Hannibal may have killed as many as 150,000 Romans and allied soldiers, by some estimates, 1/5 of all adult men in Rome and its allied cities. For context, that is 3 times the number of dead the far more populous United States lost across the entire Vietnam War. He had done it with 3 battles, each one different, each one exploiting a different Roman failure. At the Trebia River in 218 BC, Hannibal used cold, hunger, and habit against Sempronius Longus. He sent Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman camp before dawn, provoking the impulsive consul to order his army across a freezing river without food, without warm-up, without reconnaissance. The Romans crossed in December cold, waded through ice water to their waists, emerged on the far bank hypothermic and hungry, and walked into a waiting formation with his brother Mago's cavalry concealed in a dry streambed on the flank. The ambush closed. Approximately 20,000 Romans died. The consul escaped with a fragment of cavalry. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, Hannibal constructed the largest ambush in ancient military history. He hid approximately 40,000 soldiers in the hills flanking a narrow lakeside road in the pre-dawn fog of an April morning, then marched his column conspicuously along the lakeshore to draw consul Gaius Flaminius in pursuit. Flaminius, whose aggressive instincts Hannibal had studied and calibrated against, did not send scouts ahead. He marched his army into the defile at first light. The ambush triggered simultaneously along the entire column. Approximately 15,000 Romans died. Many more drowned in the lake trying to escape. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting. 6,000 Romans who managed to form up and break free were surrounded by Maharbal's cavalry the following day and surrendered. Rome's response was to appoint Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy that Polybius considered strategically sound and that Roman popular opinion found infuriating. Harass Hannibal's supply lines, avoid pitched battle, deny him forage, wait for attrition to do what legions couldn't. It was working. Roman political will broke first. Fabius earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, initially as an insult, used by senators who thought caution was cowardice. The word would eventually be reclaimed as a compliment, but not before the strategy was abandoned. In the spring of 216 BC, Hannibal moved. He seized the grain storage depot at the ruined citadel of Cannae in the Apulian plain, placing himself between the Roman army and its primary food supply. Polybius records that the capture caused great commotion in the Roman army, for it was not only the loss of the place and the stores in it that distressed them, but the fact that it commanded the surrounding district. This was calculated provocation. Hannibal had selected his battlefield and was waiting for Rome to come to him. The Senate authorized the raising of 8 legions, double the standard consular force. Rome's largest army ever assembled would march south and destroy Hannibal before he destroyed Rome. The logic seemed unassailable. They had tried caution and found it politically unsustainable. They had tried smaller armies and watched Hannibal dismantle them. Now they would try overwhelming weight. In the summer of 216 BC, 86,000 Roman and allied soldiers marched toward Cannae. Standard doctrine held that sufficient numbers made defeat impossible. Standard doctrine had not yet been introduced to the flat plain near the Aufidus River, where a man with one eye was already waiting, and had been waiting for years. Rome sent 2 men to kill Hannibal. They disagreed on almost everything, except that the other one was wrong. Lucius Aemilius Paulus came from the ancient gens Aemilia, patrician lineage stretching back generations of military service. He had held his first consulship in 219 BC alongside Marcus Livius Salinator, defeating Demetrius of Pharos in the Second Illyrian War and earning a triumph. The formal procession through Rome granted only to generals who had killed or captured a specified number of enemies. He understood terrain, command, and the particular danger of fighting a Carthaginian general who had already dismantled 3 Roman armies by exploiting the predictability of Roman tactical doctrine. When Hannibal seized Cannae and Rome began assembling its great army, Paulus argued for caution. The flat Apulian plain, he pointed out, was precisely the kind of ground that maximized the effectiveness of cavalry. Hannibal had more cavalry, better cavalry. The ground should be chosen carefully, or not at all. Gaius Terentius Varro argued the opposite, and the Roman people agreed with him. Varro came from a plebeian family, his father reportedly a butcher, who left an inheritance significant enough to launch a political career. Ancient sources, primarily Polybius and Livy, characterize him as rash, overconfident, and eager for the kind of decisive victory that would make his name. He had campaigned for the consulship of 216 BC on the explicit promise of ending the war quickly, attacking Hannibal directly, and delivering the result that Fabius's strategy of delay had failed to provide. The Roman people elected him by a substantial margin. But here, a critical caveat must be entered. Polybius, who is generally the more reliable ancient source, was not a neutral observer of this story. He served the family of Scipio Aemilianus, who was descended from Paulus. The systematic condemnation of Varro and elevation of Paulus that runs through ancient sources on Cannae reflects, at least in part, the interests of men who had every reason to protect Paulus's reputation and none to protect Varro's. Modern historians, including those cited in Wikipedia's analysis, note that Varro may have been made the war's convenient scapegoat by an aristocratic tradition that controlled the historical record. What the record does confirm is the structural problem their partnership created. Roman Republican tradition required consuls commanding a combined army to alternate daily command. Each man held authority on alternating days, with the other man subordinate. The arrangement was designed for political balance, not military coherence. It meant the most important strategic decision, whether to engage Hannibal on the plain, would be made not by the more cautious or more experienced general, but by whichever general happened to hold command on the day Hannibal accepted battle. On August 2nd, 216 BC, it was Varro's day. Ancient sources, filtered through pro-patrician bias, describe Varro as issuing orders on his command day without consulting Paulus. Livy even insinuates this explicitly. Whether true or embellished, the practical effect was identical. The Roman army deployed on flat ground in bright August sunlight, with a hot southern wind beginning to build behind the Carthaginian lines. Paulus took the Roman cavalry on the right wing, positioned against the Aufidus River. Varro commanded the allied cavalry on the left. Together, they had approximately 86,000 men. Britannica estimates roughly half lacked significant battle experience, the army having been rapidly expanded beyond Rome's normal training pipeline. The army's very size was part of the problem. War History Online notes that the two consular forces may not have been fully integrated, even by the morning of battle, having linked up perhaps less than a week before. The largest Roman army in history may have functioned tactically, as two armies in close proximity rather than one. Across the plain, watching them deploy, Hannibal made no adjustment to his formation whatsoever. He didn't need to. The Romans were doing exactly what he had predicted they would do, on exactly the ground he had selected for that prediction. The irony of Paulus, the general who was right, dying on the field, while Varro, the general who was wrong, escaped with 50 cavalry to eventually receive a public ovation for surviving, is one the ancient sources linger on with obvious satisfaction. History, filtered through the winners of political arguments, has its own gravitational pull. Every army Hannibal commanded was a coalition that should have been a liability. He made it a weapon. At Cannae, the Carthaginian force totaled approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Figures both Polybius and Livy confirm, and which modern sources broadly support. Against Rome's 86,000, this represented a numerical disadvantage of nearly 2 to 1 in infantry. But War History Online's analysis of the force compositions identifies the critical asymmetry. The Carthaginian army had 1 horseman for every 4-foot soldiers, while Rome's ratio was 1 horseman for every 13 infantry. That gap, cavalry at 5-3 Carthaginian superiority in the arm best suited to the open plain Hannibal had chosen, is the single arithmetic fact that explains Cannae more completely than any other. The army itself was a remarkable assembly. The Libyan heavy infantry, elite troops numbering approximately 8,000 to 12,000, formed the professional corps. After Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Polybius records explicitly that these veterans had been largely re-equipped with captured Roman armor and weapons, stripped from the dead of earlier battles. By Cannae, Hannibal's best soldiers looked like Roman legionaries. They carried Roman shields. They wore Roman mail. The psychological dimension of this detail would reveal itself at the battle's decisive moment. When the trap closed, men fighting for their lives would find it difficult to distinguish enemies from allies in the press of bodies. In the center of the crescent that Hannibal was designing, he placed his Iberians and Gauls, approximately 16,000 to 20,000 warriors of dramatically different fighting traditions. The Iberians wore distinctive white linen tunics and carried the falcata, a forward-weighted curved sword whose design allowed a chopping motion rather than the thrusting technique required by Roman blades. The Gauls fought differently still, many bare-chested with long, slashing swords designed for power strokes that required room to execute. These were not Hannibal's best infantry. They were his most expendable, and their role at Cannae was not to win their fight, but to survive it long enough to bend rather than break. The distinction between those 2 outcomes was the entire battle. On the wings rode cavalry of 2 very different types. On the left wing, positioned nearest the Aufidus river bank, Hasdrubal commanded approximately 6,000 Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry, veterans who had been campaigning in Italy for nearly 2 years, and who would be deliberately placed in a constricted space against the Roman citizen cavalry opposite them. On the right wing, 4,000 Numidian light horsemen prepared for their very different assignment. The Numidians rode without saddles or bridles, guiding their horses with knee pressure and a rope around the neck, carrying small shields and javelins, masters of the hit-and-run harassment that could occupy an enemy indefinitely without offering decisive contact. The distinction mattered. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry was designed to win and then do something extraordinary with the victory. The Numidians were designed simply to keep the Allied cavalry too busy to interfere. One identification controversy must be noted. Polybius names Hanno as the commander of the right-wing Numidian cavalry. Livy attributes that command to Maharbal, a figure whose name will become important later in this story. The discrepancy remains unresolved. Both ancient sources are drawing from imperfect information about events they did not personally witness, and on this specific question, they simply disagree. What requires no qualification is the overall design. Hannibal had built an army where each component had a precisely defined mechanical role, and where the components' interactions had been calculated in advance with a geometric precision that the ancient world had never seen at this scale. The Libyan veterans in Roman armor waiting to close the trap from the sides. The Iberian and Gallic center meant to absorb the Roman hammer without shattering. The heavy cavalry meant to win, wheel, and return. The light cavalry meant to contain. Every piece had its instruction. The Romans, marching south toward the Aufidus River, were about to discover that the entire battlefield had been assembled around their arrival. In the spring of 216 BC, Hannibal stopped running and started waiting. The Fabian strategy, harass, delay, deny battle, had been annoying him for the better part of a year. His army needed to forage, to resupply, to keep moving. A stationary army in enemy territory was a dying army, and Fabius knew it. What Hannibal needed was to force the Romans to come to him on ground he had already chosen. The grain depot at Cannae provided the mechanism. By seizing it, he placed himself between Rome's army and its food supply in the critical late summer period before harvest. Polybius records the strategic effect with characteristic precision. The capture of Cannae caused great commotion in the Roman army, for it was not only the loss of the place and the stores in it that distressed them, but the fact that it commanded the surrounding district. The Romans had to respond, and when they responded, they would be coming south, toward Apulia, toward the Aufidus River, toward the flat plain where Hannibal had decided the battle would be fought. The terrain at Cannae was not accidental. Britannica's analysis is direct. Hannibal chose flat, open ground specifically because flat, open ground maximized the effectiveness of cavalry. His cavalry superiority was the foundation of everything else he was planning. Hills, broken ground, forested terrain. Any of these would have neutralized the advantage. The plain between the Aufidus River and the surrounding low hills offered him exactly what he needed. Space for cavalry to maneuver. A riverbank on one side to anchor a flank and prevent Roman outflanking. And the kind of unobstructed approach that would allow him to read the Roman deployment from the moment they appeared. He also had the weather. Livy records it specifically in Book 22, Chapter 43. Hannibal had pitched his camp near the village, with the Volturnus wind at his back, raising clouds of dust across the parched plains. This phenomenon would prove advantageous, not only for the camp, but also during battle formation, as the Carthaginians fought with the wind at their backs against a blinded enemy. The Volturnus was a hot southern wind common to Apulia in late summer, and on August 2nd, it blew steadily from the Carthaginian lines toward the Romans. Hannibal had positioned his army facing north, deliberately, placing the Romans in a position where they would advance roughly south into the morning sun and into a sustained wind carrying dust and grit at eye level. Britannica confirms this was not coincidence. Hannibal positioned his lines facing north precisely to force the Romans into the sensory disadvantage of fighting the sun and the wind simultaneously. When the Roman army arrived and the consuls made their preliminary reconnaissance, Paulus immediately identified the problem. He wanted to fight on rocky, hilly ground unsuitable for cavalry action. Varro's position, fight here now, with the largest army Rome had ever assembled, prevailed on his command day. The Romans encamped approximately 8 kilometers from the Carthaginian position and prepared. There is one more environmental factor worth noting, though no ancient source dwells on it in detail. The Aufidus River was the only significant water source in the immediate area. In early August in Apulia, with temperatures that could exceed 40 degrees Celsius, water was not incidental to military planning. Hannibal controlled the river. His army of 50,000 had access to water. The Roman army of 86,000 was managing a thirst problem before the first sword was drawn. The resource arithmetic, like the cavalry arithmetic, favored Carthage before the battle began. War History Online raises a significant point about the Roman army's state on the morning of battle. The two consular forces, only recently combined, may have been tactically unintegrated at the unit level. Men who had not drilled together, officers who had not coordinated, formations that may not have known each other's procedures. The largest Roman army in history arrived at Cannae, carrying within itself structural vulnerabilities that Varro's aggressive confidence and Paulus's justified caution had not resolved. By dawn on August 2nd, everything was in place. On both sides of the plain, Men prepared for what they understood was the battle that would end the war. They were right about that much. Here is what made Cannae different from every battle before it. Hannibal made his weakest troops his most important weapon. Double envelopment, surrounding an enemy from multiple directions, was not a new concept in ancient warfare. Earlier commanders had achieved flanking victories of various kinds. What was unprecedented at Cannae was the scale, the mechanical precision, and above all, the specific elegance of using the enemy's own tactical doctrine as the instrument of their destruction. The Romans were not going to be tricked into a trap they didn't understand. They were going to be given exactly what they expected, and that expectation was going to kill them. The formation Hannibal deployed was a crescent, but a specific type of crescent that has attracted military analysis for more than 2,000 years. His Iberian and Gallic infantry were positioned in the center in a convex shape, bulging toward the Roman lines. The Libyan heavy infantry, in captured Roman armor, stood on both flanks slightly behind and to the sides of this center bulge. The cavalry anchored each wing. The entire configuration was designed around one prediction. The Romans would advance their massed infantry directly into the center of this crescent, believing they were breaking through, and the center would give way before them. But it would not give way by routing. It would give way by design. War on the Rocks' July 2025 analysis describes the mechanics. As the Romans pressed forward into the convex Carthaginian center, the center was planned to perform a controlled retreat, bending back under the Roman weight without breaking, the convex shape flattening and then inverting into a concave pocket. The Romans, massed too tightly to maneuver, would follow the retreating center forward, deeper and deeper into the pocket. Their rear rank soldiers would press forward, pushing the front ranks ahead of them. The formation would compress. The crucial intervals between Roman maniples, the gaps that allowed fresh troops to rotate forward, that allowed shields to be used effectively, that allowed swords to be drawn and thrust, would disappear under the weight of 80,000 bodies pressing in one direction. And as this happened, the Libyan infantry on both flanks would not move. They would stand and wait, watching the Roman columns advance past them on either side until the moment the pocket was deep enough to close. Varro had compounded the problem before the battle began. He had already massed the infantry maniples unusually close together, deeper than standard formation, the mass configured as a battering ram rather than a fighting line. His intention was to use numerical weight to break the Carthaginian center through sheer momentum. This decision removed exactly the tactical flexibility the Roman system depended upon. War on the Rocks documents the consequence with precision. Their inability to maneuver independently from the mass of the army made it impossible for them to counter the strategic encirclement. The cavalry assignment completed the geometry. Hasdrubal's 6,000 heavy horsemen on the left wing would fight and destroy the Roman citizen cavalry opposite them, in a space deliberately compressed by the riverbank to eliminate the room for Roman cavalry maneuver. After that victory, Hasdrubal would not pursue the fleeing enemy. He would wheel his force across the entire rear of the Roman army and strike the Allied cavalry on the opposite wing from behind. This cross-field ride, across the back of over 100,000 engaged soldiers, would close the rear of the pocket that the Libyan infantry would be closing from the sides. This was not improvisation. Every element had been assigned its role before the first formation stepped forward. The center would bend. The flanks would wait. The cavalry would sweep and return. The result, when all three actions were completed, would be complete encirclement of an army that had, moments before, believed it was winning. 3 questions would determine whether the trap worked: whether the Gallic and Iberian center could hold under Roman pressure without routing prematurely, whether Hasdrubal's cavalry could resist the instinct to pursue and execute the crossfield ride instead, and whether the Libyans could maintain their position unengaged for however long it took the center to bend far enough. Hannibal had prepared answers to all three. The Romans were about to discover whether preparation was sufficient. The cavalry battle by the river began in a way that cavalry battles were not supposed to begin. Hannibal had positioned Hasdrubal's 6,000 Iberian and Gallic heavy horsemen on his left wing, near the Aufidus bank, directly opposite the Roman citizen cavalry commanded by Paulus. The space between the river and the infantry formations was narrow, deliberately so. Normal cavalry combat required room to wheel, to charge from distance, to reform after contact. The bank gave neither side any of these options. What it gave instead was a front of compressed violence, where the side with more men and better cavalry could simply overwhelm its opposite. Paulus commanded approximately 2,400 to 3,200 Roman equites. The citizen cavalry drawn from Rome's aristocratic equestrian class, men of senatorial families and equestrian rank. Against them, 6,000 veterans of 3 Italian campaigns. Polybius describes what happened with the bluntness of a man documenting something he found remarkable. Many of the Iberian and Celtic horsemen actually dismounted, not from weakness, but because the confined space left no room for mounted combat. They fought on foot at close quarters in a press of bodies between the river and the infantry. Polybius called the struggle barbaric, his word for its utter, grinding brutality. There were no charges from distance, no sweeping maneuvers, no tactical elegance. Men killed each other at arm's length. The Carthaginians held the numbers advantage and the quality advantage. They pressed both. When the Roman cavalry broke, Polybius records that Hasdrubal's men cut down their Roman opponents without giving quarter. Paulus was wounded in this fighting. Livy records that a slingstone struck him. He was unhorsed, continued fighting on foot, surrounded by his personal guard, wounded in a battle he had argued against fighting on this ground. He would spend the rest of the afternoon dying slowly in the dust. The Roman general who had been right about everything that mattered. What happened immediately after the cavalry victory is the moment that separates Hasdrubal from every cavalry commander of his era. He did not pursue. Polybius documents this with an emphasis that signals he understood its significance. After destroying the Roman right wing, Hasdrubal kept his victorious force together. He gave the order to wheel, not after the fleeing Romans, not toward the Carthaginian infantry center, but across the back of the entire Roman formation. 6,000 cavalry, beginning a ride around the rear of a battle involving over 100,000 men. The crossed field between the Roman right wing and the Allied cavalry on the left, with the full depth of the Roman infantry formation between them, was perhaps a kilometer or more. The ride would have taken minutes that felt like an eternity, during which Hasdrubal had to hold his victorious cavalry together, moving in disciplined formation, resisting the momentum of pursuit and the chaos of the larger battle raging beside them. The decision not to pursue a broken enemy is one of the hardest orders to execute in ancient warfare. The instinct of victorious cavalry was to chase, to kill, to exploit. Hasdrubal had been given different instructions, and he followed them. That discipline, that specific, counter-instinctual act of self-control at the moment of triumph, would seal the fate of 50,000 Romans. It would not be recognized as the decisive act it was until the trap closed completely. On the opposite wing, the Numidian containment was holding. The Allied cavalry had its hands full with harassment they couldn't shake and couldn't pin. And across the plain, the Roman infantry center was advancing into the crescent's embrace. believing the battle was going exactly as planned. The Romans were winning. They knew they were winning. That was the trap. As the infantry lines closed, the velites, Rome's light skirmishers, opened with javelins, then withdrew through the gaps in the maniple formation in the prescribed tactical sequence. The heavy infantry took their place. The Roman center advanced into the convex Carthaginian crescent, and what they encountered was resistance that felt like the beginning of collapse. The Iberian and Gallic infantry pushed back, held briefly, and then gave ground. Slowly, fighting, not routing, retreating in controlled order, step by measured step, as the Roman mass leaned into them with the weight of tens of thousands of bodies moving in one direction. Polybius describes the mechanics of this retreat as deliberate, a planned withdrawal designed to invert the formation's shape. As the Romans pressed forward and the center gave way, the convex bulge that had faced the Roman lines flattened. Then it began to bow inward, curving back toward the Carthaginian rear. The Romans, packed so tightly they had lost the formation intervals that allowed for tactical flexibility, did not understand what the change in shape meant. They interpreted the backward movement as imminent breakthrough. They pushed harder. Rear-rank Roman soldiers pressed forward into the front ranks. The front ranks had no room to push back. The intervals between maniples, the architectural feature of Roman military organization that allowed fresh troops to rotate forward, that allowed the triplex acies to function as a flexible fighting machine rather than a mob. These intervals compressed under the weight of thousands of bodies moving in a single direction. Men who had trained their entire adult lives in a system built on spacing and rotation now found themselves in a formation where spacing had ceased to exist. The pilum, Rome's primary offensive weapon, required a throwing motion. A javelin launched from a short distance to penetrate shields and render them unusable before the sword work began. In the compression that was building, there was no room to throw. Men gripped weapons they could not effectively use in a formation they could no longer control, advancing because the men behind them were advancing, and there was nowhere else to go. On both flanks, the Libyan infantry had not moved. Through the entire sequence, the cavalry fight by the river, the velites exchange, the initial infantry contact, the first minutes of the center's controlled retreat, the Libyans stood in formation and watched. These were Hannibal's best-equipped soldiers, many wearing the captured Roman armor from Trebia and Trasimene. They waited at the edges of the developing pocket as the Roman columns advanced past them on either side, deeper and deeper into the curvature of the retreating center. The pocket was not yet closed. The Libyans were waiting for it to reach the right depth. The Roman soldiers pressing forward could not see the geometry forming around them. They could see the enemy in front of them giving ground, which their training told them meant the enemy was breaking. They could not see the Libyans on their flanks because the density of their own formation blocked lateral visibility. They could not see Hasdrubal's cavalry completing its crossfield ride because the cavalry was behind them. They could not feel the trap closing because the trap closed at the speed of a formation's footsteps on a summer afternoon, one step at a time, each step individually indistinguishable from a step toward victory. The soldiers in the outermost ranks of the Roman mass, nearest the flanks, were the first to sense something wrong. The pressure that should have been on their front was coming from the sides. The Libyans were beginning to move. On the opposite wing, the 4,000 Numidian cavalry were doing something that looked, from a distance, like failure. That was the assignment. The Roman allied cavalry on the left wing numbered approximately 4,800, slightly more than the Numidians opposite them. The allied cavalry held the numerical edge. In any standard cavalry engagement, the larger force should have won, or at minimum, forced a decision. The Numidians had no intention of producing a decision. Their fighting style made prolonged containment possible in a way that heavier cavalry could not have achieved. They rode without saddles, without bridles, controlling their horses through knee pressure and a rope looped around the animal's neck. Their weapons were javelins and short swords. Their shields were small. Their armor was minimal. What they had instead was speed, agility, and a tactical tradition built entirely around the avoidance of decisive contact. They swirled at the edge of engagement distance, launching javelins, pulling back, circling, returning from unexpected angles, never committing to the kind of sustained formation combat that would have allowed the heavier Allied cavalry to use its numbers effectively. Polybius records the result. The Allied cavalry was kept fully occupied, unable to reinforce the Roman infantry center, unable to move toward the river to support Paulus's cavalry, unable to form up in the kind of coherent mass that might have threatened Hasdrubal's crossfield ride. The Numidians were not trying to destroy the Allied horse. They were keeping it in place, draining its energy and attention, buying time. The time ran out when Hasdrubal arrived. Having completed the crossfield ride across the rear of the Roman formation, Hasdrubal's 6,000 heavy cavalry appeared behind the Allied horse. Men already committed against the Numidians in front of them, unable to turn and face a threat they hadn't seen coming from a direction they hadn't secured. Attacked simultaneously from front and rear, the Allied cavalry broke. The Numidians shifted from containment to pursuit, chasing the broken Allied horsemen off the field. The Roman army had arrived at Cannae with approximately 6,000 cavalry on both wings. By this point in the engagement, the cavalry was gone. Varro escaped with approximately 50 cavalry, his personal guard, and a fragment of survivors. The man who had commanded the largest Roman army in history rode away from the battle with the remnants of a personal escort. The infantry, all 80,000 of them still standing, now fought with both flanks exposed, both wings destroyed. And Hasdrubal's 6,000 heavy cavalry, fresh from 2 victories and a crossfield ride, free to close the rear of the pocket that the Libyans were closing from the sides. 3 simultaneous pressures were about to converge on a mass of men already so compressed they could barely lift their arms. The geometry Hannibal had designed over months of planning was about to complete its final calculation. Here is the moment the battle stopped being a battle. The Libyan infantry had waited through the entire sequence. The cavalry fights on both wings, the initial infantry exchange, the controlled retreat of the Iberian and Gallic center. They had stood in formation and watched the Roman columns advance past them on both flanks, deeper and deeper into the concave pocket the center had created. Polybius records the moment of the wheel with the precision of someone who had reconstructed it from participant accounts. As the Roman columns had advanced far enough past the Libyan positions, the Libyans turned inward. Not a gradual reorientation, a deliberate wheel at right angles, bringing their formation around to face the exposed sides of the Roman mass. These were Hannibal's best soldiers, in captured Roman armor, striking from the flanks of a formation that was already too compressed to turn and face them. The men on the outer edges of the Roman mass were the first to feel it. Pressure from the sides where there should have been open space. Resistance coming from a direction that training had not prepared them to defend against in their current configuration. The men deeper in the mass didn't know it was happening yet. They were still pressing forward. At approximately the same moment, Hasdrubal's cavalry struck the rear. The encirclement was complete. In front, the Iberian and Gallic center, no longer retreating, now holding the pocket shut from the front. On both sides, the Libyan heavy infantry and Roman armor, closing inward. At the rear, 6,000 cavalry, fresh and organized, sealing the one exit the compressed mass might otherwise have used to escape. Britannica describes what this meant in physical terms. A killing zone barely a few hundred meters across, containing upward of 50,000 soldiers with no room to maneuver, no direction to flee, and no cavalry to break through the encirclement from inside. The Roman shield, the scutum, a large curved rectangular board of wood and iron, was designed for advancing behind, for forming a wall moving in one direction. In a 360-degree fight with no room to swing it, it became a liability. The gladius required a stabbing motion that needed the arm drawn back. In the compression, drawing the arm back was impossible. Rome's weapons were designed for a tactical system that the compression had destroyed. Dickinson College commentaries, analyzing Polybius and Livy's casualty figures against the battle's estimated duration, calculates that more than 100 Romans may have been dying every minute at the height of the slaughter. The estimated duration is itself a modern inference. No ancient source specifies the killing phase's length in hours. But the calculation is rooted in figures both primary sources broadly confirm, and what it represents is not a statistic, but a sensory reality. The sound and smell and physical density of that afternoon, in that pocket, on that plain. The British military historian Adrian Goldsworthy frames the scale in terms that cross 2 millennia. He compares Cannae's death toll to the massed slaughter of the British Army on the first day of the Somme in 1916. The comparison illuminates the number's weight. The Somme is remembered as among the worst single days in modern military history. Cannae's figures, by most estimates, were worse, achieved not by industrial artillery, but by the mechanical closure of a geometric trap that a 31-year-old with one functioning eye had designed in advance. The killing continued until nightfall stopped it. Not until the trapped men stopped fighting. Not until surrender, until the sun went down and darkness made the work impossible to continue. The men in the inner rings of the encirclement were not killed by Carthaginian soldiers. They were killed by the men next to them. This is not metaphor. It is the physical reality of extreme compression. Polybius and Livy both describe the press of bodies as so extreme that men in the center of the mass could not raise their arms. The Roman scutum required space to use. The arm behind it needed room to push. In the compression, it was pinned. The gladius required a stabbing thrust. The arm needed to draw back before it could extend. In the compression, drawing back was impossible. Men who had trained their entire adult lives in one of the ancient world's most disciplined fighting systems found that system had been taken from them, not by enemy action, but by the weight of their own comrades pressing from behind. Livy records a detail that military historians have debated for centuries. After the battle, he writes, Roman bodies were found with their heads buried in holes they had dug themselves, men who had voluntarily suffocated rather than continue experiencing what the pocket had become. Livy is the only ancient source for this specific detail, and it cannot be independently confirmed. But the psychological context it implies is consistent with everything else Polybius documents about the battle's final phase, and most modern historians treat it as plausible, if not certain. The Iberian falcata was particularly suited to what the killing zone had become. Unlike the Roman gladius, which required a thrusting motion, or the Gallic longsword, which required room for a slashing blow, the falcata's forward-weighted curved blade allowed a chopping action that could be executed in minimal space. The mechanics of an axe more than a sword. The weapon's design, originally developed for Iberian infantry fighting in dense formations, proved devastatingly effective against the Roman helmets of the period. This is a reasonable inference from the weapon's documented characteristics rather than a specific Polybius or Livy attribution, and should be understood as such. What both primary sources agree on is the duration and the completeness. The killing phase lasted until nightfall, not minutes, but hours. Sustained slaughter in a space so confined that the Carthaginian soldiers working inward from the edges did not need tactics, only time. The men in the center of the pocket were dying from compression and suffocation before Carthaginian blades reached them. The men in the outer rings were fighting back as effectively as the space allowed, which was not very effectively at all. Somewhere in the middle of this, Paulus died. His body was found on the field afterward. He had refused the horse offered by the tribune Lentulus to escape. Livy and multiple consistent ancient sources record this tradition, though all accounts are post-battle reconstruction rather than eyewitness documentation. Paulus had argued against fighting on this ground. He had been overruled. He died in the trap he had predicted, on the terrain he had tried to avoid, while the general who had insisted on fighting here rode away with 50 cavalry. The number of individual acts of courage or cowardice within that pocket will never be known. The chronicles record the outcome, not the interior. Tens of thousands of men fought and died in a space the size of a few city blocks, in heat and dust and the noise of their own dying, over the course of an afternoon that neither they, nor anyone who later tried to describe it, could fully comprehend. The numbers historians debate are themselves a measure of how far beyond normal warfare Cannae had gone. Polybius, writing approximately 66 years after the battle and drawing on interviews with survivors of the Second Punic War, records 70,000 Roman and Allied infantry dead, 10,000 captured, and perhaps 3,000 survivors. He also specifies that of the 6,000 Roman and Allied cavalry, only 370 survived. Livy, writing roughly a century and a half later and drawing primarily on Fabius Pictor, a Roman senator who actually fought in the war, records 45,500 infantry dead and approximately 2,700 cavalry killed, with nearly 20,000 captured. Appian gives 50,000 dead. Plutarch agrees with 50,000. Quintilian estimates 60,000. Eutropius counts 40,000 foot soldiers and 3,500 horse. Modern historians, analyzing the logistical constraints of the battle's duration and geography, generally favor Livy's range as more defensible than Polybius's higher figure, placing Roman dead at approximately 47,000 to 50,000. Some scholars, including Martin Samuels in 1990, argue even that figure is too high, proposing estimates as low as 10,000 to 16,000. The majority position accepts something between Livy's range and the broader ancient consensus. What no scholar disputes is the scale. By any serious estimate, between 20% and 30% of the entire Roman army died on that plain in a single afternoon. The aristocratic losses went beyond arithmetic. Britannica documents the specific toll: Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus killed. The consul of the previous year, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, killed. Marcus Minucius Rufus, former master of horse, killed. 28 of Rome's 40 military tribunes killed. Up to 80 Romans of senatorial or high magistrate rank killed. At least 200 knights of equestrian rank killed. Britannica estimates that 20% of all Roman fighting men between the ages of 18 and 50 died at Cannae. This was not merely a military catastrophe. It was a decapitation of the Roman state. The men who led its armies, staffed its senate, administered its law, and represented its aristocratic continuity, dead in an afternoon on an Apulian plain. Hannibal had his own accounting method. According to Livy, his brother Barca was sent to Carthage to report the victory to the Carthaginian Senate and argue for reinforcements. Mago arrived with proof. Before the assembled senators, he poured out 3.5 modi, a Roman unit of dry measure roughly equivalent to about 9 liters, of gold rings stripped from the fingers of dead Roman senators and knights. The rings were not merely trophies. They were identification. Roman senators and equestrians wore gold rings as a mark of their rank. Mago's pile of rings was a census of the dead aristocracy, a physical roster of Rome's ruling class, rendered in gold on a Carthaginian floor. Livy's account of this scene is the only surviving source for the specific detail. And the precision of the measurement, 3.5 modi, not many or countless, suggests a documentary or oral basis for the specific figure. Carthaginian losses, by comparison, were significant but not catastrophic. Polybius records 5,700 dead, 4,000 Gauls, 1,500 Hispanics and Africans, 200 cavalry. Livy gives approximately 8,000 dead. The Gallic center, the men who had bent under the Roman hammer for hours, paid the price that the trap's design had assigned them. Their sacrifice had made everything else possible. 3.5 modi of gold rings. Every ring, a man. Every man, a family still waiting for news that had already left the battlefield without them. News of Cannae reached Rome before most of the survivors did. Livy describes the scene with a phrase that historians have returned to across 2 millennia. Never, when the city was in safety, was there so great a panic and confusion within the walls of Rome. Women thronged the temples demanding news. Crowds gathered at the city gates where messengers arrived. The Senate itself had lost 80 of its members on the field. The institution that would have to organize Rome's response was missing the men who would have led that organization. The city that had survived its sacking by the Gauls in 386 BC, that had built an empire across Italy and Sicily through 2 centuries of continuous warfare, stood in the summer of 216 BC, looking at the possibility that Hannibal would appear before its walls within days. What Rome did in the weeks that followed is, in military historiographical terms, at least as remarkable as anything Hannibal accomplished on August 2nd. The Senate enacted measures it had never contemplated before. The Sibylline books, Rome's repository of prophetic guidance for moments of national crisis, were consulted. A delegation was dispatched to the Delphic oracle in Greece. Then the Senate did something that stands as one of the most documented acts of Roman religious desperation in the historical record. 4 people were buried alive in the Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market. 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks were interred in a specially prepared pit as human sacrifice to appease the gods. Livy records this. Multiple modern sources confirm it. The act was recognized, even at the time, as exceptional. Human sacrifice was not standard Roman religious practice. And its authorization measures the depth of what the Senate understood had just happened. The military response was equally extraordinary. The minimum age for military service was lowered. Criminals and debtors were conscripted. Men who did not meet the standard property qualification were enrolled regardless. 8,000 slaves were purchased from their owners by the Roman state and inducted as soldiers, with the promise of freedom for service, a social transformation of enormous significance in a society whose legal structure was built on the absolute distinction between free and slave. Within 1 month of Cannae, according to Dickinson College commentaries, Rome had raised 4 new legions. When the surviving consul, Varro, returned to Rome, the Senate's response defied every expectation that military failure should produce accountability. He was greeted publicly and thanked for not despairing of the state, a formulation that acknowledged the defeat without assigning formal blame. No trial followed. The Republic needed every surviving senior figure to maintain institutional function, and Varro was it. The same sources that recorded his rashness before the battle recorded his steadiness afterward, reorganizing survivors, maintaining order, refusing to collapse. Whatever his role in the disaster, his conduct in its aftermath was disciplined. A note on one famous scene that should be treated with care. Livy records that the young military tribune Publius Cornelius Scipio, a survivor of Cannae, later known as Scipio Africanus, forced a group of wavering nobles at sword point to swear not to abandon Rome. The story is dramatic and consistent with Scipio's later character. Polybius, however, does not record it. Wikipedia's analysis labels it probably a late invention. It may reflect a real incident, or it may be later tradition, building the legend of the man who would eventually defeat Hannibal. It is attributed here to Livy only, and the distinction matters. The Senate banned the word peace, decreed that public mourning would not exceed 30 days, prohibited public tears even from women. Rome was telling itself a story about what kind of entity it was. One that did not negotiate from catastrophe, did not mourn beyond prescribed limits, did not mistake a battle for a war. Whether that story was true or whether it became true through the telling is a question historians have debated ever since. What the historical record confirms is the outcome. Rome did not surrender, did not sue for peace, did not abandon the field. It reorganized, rearmed, and returned to the Fabian strategy it had abandoned. But this time, the men practicing it were not delaying from political cowardice. They were waiting to become something that could beat Hannibal on his own terms. Here is one of the most debated exchanges in ancient military history, recorded by one source, absent from another, and questioned by modern scholars. Livy records it. Polybius does not. The difference between those two facts tells us more about Cannae's legacy than the conversation itself may actually contain. According to Livy, in Book 22, Chapter 51, after the killing stopped, Maharbal, described as the commander of Hannibal's cavalry, urged an immediate march on Rome. The road was open. The army was victorious. The city had perhaps 8,000 defenders. In 5 days, you will be feasting as victor in the capital, Livy has Maharbal say. Follow me. I will go in advance with the cavalry. They will know that you are come before they know that you are coming. Hannibal replied that he commended the zeal, but needed time to consider the plan. Maharbal's response has become the most quoted line from any ancient battle narrative. Assuredly, no one man has been blessed with all God's gifts. You, Hannibal, know how to gain a victory. You do not know how to use it. The problem with this exchange is that Polybius, whose account of Cannae is generally considered more reliable than Livy's, and who had interviewed survivors of the Second Punic War, does not record it. Wikipedia's article on Maharbal notes that the story derives from what scholars have identified as a notoriously corrupt and unreliable manuscript of Livy, and that Maharbal's presence at Cannae as cavalry commander is itself in dispute. Polybius names Hanno as the right-wing cavalry commander, while Livy attributes the role to Maharbal. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing centuries after Cannae, complained in his satires that his schoolteacher poisons me every 5th day with his dreadful Hannibal, specifically the question of whether Hannibal should have marched. The debate was literally Roman school curriculum for generations. Famous as the exchange became, its historical foundation is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that Hannibal chose not to march. And most modern military historians defend that decision, regardless of whether Maharbal said anything. Rome was approximately 230 miles from Cannae. 2 weeks' march for an exhausted army that had just sustained 6,000 casualties and fought for several hours in August heat. Hannibal had no siege equipment capable of investing a fortified city of Rome's size, population, and walls. The military expert Robert O'Connell, cited in Wikipedia's analysis, writes directly, "In fact, there were many good reasons for not marching on Rome, and only one good reason for going. The city could have mobilized tens of thousands of defenders within days. Hannibal's strategic goal, as understood by most modern scholars, was not to physically destroy Rome, but to dismantle its alliance system. He believed that after sufficient battlefield catastrophes, Rome's Italian allies would defect en masse, depriving Rome of its manpower base and forcing a negotiated peace. Marching on an unbreachable city would not have achieved that." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, one of the few modern military figures to weigh in with a dissenting opinion, believed Hannibal was right, that when a more powerful adversary is down, they must be finished. His position remains a legitimate minority view among military analysts. What the historical record documents is what Hannibal actually did. He sent the Roman prisoners back for ransom at moderate terms and dispatched a delegation under Carthalo to Rome to negotiate a peace treaty. The Roman Senate refused to receive the delegation, refused to ransom the prisoners, refused to discuss peace, banned the word. Hannibal had miscalculated the one thing he couldn't outmaneuver. He had predicted, correctly, that battlefield catastrophes would erode Rome's will. He had not fully anticipated the institutional stubbornness of a city that had survived being sacked before, that could enroll slaves as soldiers, that could thank a general for surviving the worst defeat in its history. Rome's core Italian allies, watching how Rome responded to Cannae, by continuing, by refusing, by reorganizing rather than collapsing, mostly decided that Rome was worth staying loyal to. The defections Hannibal needed at scale never fully materialized. He would spend 11 more years in Italy. He would win more battles. He would never achieve a second Cannae because Rome would not give him one. The Fabian strategy, despised and abandoned and restored after catastrophe, proved in the end to be the correct answer to a general who could only win through the specific conditions of open field battle. The most tactically perfect engagement in ancient military history was, in the span of 16 years, revealed as strategically insufficient. The chronicles record the decision not to march. They do not record what Hannibal thought, alone, in the days and weeks that followed. That interior is lost with Carthage. Rome thanked Varro for not despairing. For the ordinary soldiers who had survived the killing, it had a different response. In 215 BC, the Roman Senate made a decision whose irony would not become clear for more than a decade. The survivors of Cannae, the soldiers who had escaped the pocket, who had rallied at Venusia and Canusium, who represented the living remnant of the largest army Rome had ever assembled, were stripped of their civil rights and sent to garrison Sicily indefinitely. The punishment was for surviving a shameful defeat. The legions were organized into Legio Quinta and Legio Sexta, the 5th and 6th legions, formally numbered as if this stripped rights posting were a regular assignment, but understood by everyone as exile. They would not be permitted to return to Italy until the war ended. They received no land grants, no promises of triumph, no prospect of the rewards that Roman military service was supposed to provide. Their crime was that they had been in the wrong formation on the wrong afternoon in the wrong year. They served in Sicily for years, garrisoning a province while Hannibal continued his Italian campaign and Rome fought for survival on multiple fronts simultaneously. The war against Hannibal in Italy the war against Philip V of Macedonia, who had allied with Carthage after Cannae, the campaigns in Spain to cut Hannibal's supply lines. Rome was fighting on 3 fronts, with an army supplemented by freed slaves and conscripted debtors. The men of the Cannae legions cleaned their equipment and waited. In 205 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio was elected consul. He had survived Cannae as a military tribune at approximately 21 years old, watching his father-in-law Paulus die on the field. He had spent the years since rising through a military career of exceptional distinction, capturing Carthago Nova in Spain, destroying Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula, developing tactical innovations that inverted Hannibal's own methods against Hasdrubal Gisco at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC. He arrived at his consulship with a plan: invade Africa, threaten Carthage directly, force the recall of Hannibal from Italy. The Senate was skeptical. Conservative senators, led by Fabius Maximus, opposed the plan. The Senate offered Scipio Sicily as his province, with permission to cross into Africa if he deemed it advisable. They gave him no additional legions, limiting him to the forces already stationed on the island. The Senate believed it was giving him second-rate troops and a grudging mandate. What the Senate gave Scipio was Legio Quinta and Legio Sexta. The men of Cannae, soldiers who had spent a decade in disgrace, stripped of civil rights, denied the rewards of service, warehoused in Sicily for the crime of surviving. Military historians, including Samuel Rocca in his academic analysis of these units, document what those years had produced. Not broken soldiers, but the hardest, most combat-experienced infantry in Roman service, forged through years of frustrated competence into something that peacetime legions could not replicate. Scipio recognized what he had. He took them to Africa. At Zama in 202 BC, those same soldiers, the men punished for living through Cannae, fought in the army that finally defeated Hannibal Barca. The irony is not manufactured for dramatic effect. It is documented history, reconstructed from Livy and confirmed by modern scholars. The disgraced survivors of Rome's greatest defeat were present at Carthage's greatest defeat, and the circle that closed at Zama had opened on the plain near the Aufidus River 16 years before. The Romans lost Cannae because they fought like Romans. They won Zama because Scipio had learned to fight like Hannibal. The institutional consequence of Cannae was not merely military reorganization, but a fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying Roman military doctrine. Wikipedia's article on the Battle of Cannae records the conclusion directly. Cannae played a major role in shaping the military structure and tactical organization of the Republican army. The triplexacies, the 3-line system of hastati, principes, and triaria that had served Rome for generations, was not abandoned, but its rigidity was recognized as a vulnerability. The maniple system, for all its flexibility compared to earlier phalanx warfare, had proven catastrophically inflexible when compressed into a mass too dense to maneuver. The lesson was absorbed slowly over years of continued campaigning, but it was absorbed. The command structure changed too. The alternating consul system that had put Varro in command on the wrong day was not immediately abandoned. Roman politics moved slowly, but unified command became increasingly the operational reality. Scipio's appointment as general-in-chief for the African campaign, which the historian Hans Delbrück wrote, may have violated the constitutional laws of the Roman Republic, but effected an internal transformation that increased her military potentiality enormously. Represented the war's logical conclusion: a single commander with full authority, accountable for success or failure. capable of strategic coherence across an entire theater. Scipio's own tactical development shows how directly Cannae's lessons were absorbed and inverted. At the Battle of Illapa in 206 BC, facing Hasdrubal Gisco's Carthaginian and Numidian army in Spain, Scipio deployed his forces for several consecutive days in a predictable standard formation. Roman legions in the center, allied troops on the wings, training the Carthaginians to expect a specific arrangement. Then on the morning of decision, he reversed it. Allied troops in the center, the Roman legions on the wings. UNRV. Roman history documents the result. The Romans effectively enveloping the Carthaginians by outflanking them on both sides, ironically reversing the formation that Hannibal had used to devastate the Romans at Cannae. The student had identified the master's technique, studied it until he understood its mechanics, and applied it against the master's own subordinates. Zama in 202 BC was the culmination. The armies were roughly equal in infantry, but the cavalry balance had reversed entirely. Massinissa, the Numidian king who had served Carthage and changed sides, brought his cavalry to Scipio's army. Hannibal arrived at Zama with the disadvantage Paulus had faced at Cannae. Inferior cavalry on both wings, fighting on open ground. The battle was decided by cavalry, as Cannae had been decided by cavalry, except this time the decisive sweep came from Massinissa's Numidians and Scipio's allied horse, returning after the initial cavalry victory to close the rear of Hannibal's formation. Hannibal lost Zama using the same tactical principle he had used to win Cannae. The encirclement reversed, the cavalry the instrument, the logistics of the campaign, the 16 years of Italian campaigning without adequate reinforcement. The Carthaginian Senate's failure to send what Mago had argued for with his pile of rings had stripped him of the cavalry that made his system work. At Zama, he had the genius and the plan and the veteran infantry. He did not have Hasdrubal. Carthage accepted peace in 201 BC. The terms were comprehensive. Loss of all overseas territories, fleet reduced to 10 warships, an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, and prohibition from waging war outside Africa or in Africa without Rome's permission. Hannibal, by then serving as a Carthaginian statesman trying to reform the state's finances, reportedly spoke in the Carthaginian Senate in favor of accepting the treaty. The general who had crossed the Alps to destroy Rome argued for peace with Rome. He was 50 years old and had spent most of those years at war. The war had been his father's idea before it was his own, and his father had died in ambush before the worst of it began. In 1904, a German field marshal titled his entire body of operational doctrine after a battle that had been fought 2,100 years earlier. Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff from 1891 to 1906, wrote a treatise on military theory and named it Cannae, not Principles of Encirclement or On the Double Envelopment. Cannae, specifically, the battle on the plain near the Aufidus River. The afternoon Hasdrubal's cavalry swept across the rear and the Libyans wheeled inward. Schlieffen's collected works were published in 1913, the year of his death, and translated by the United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in 1931. American military officers literally studying Polybius's battle in their officer education nearly 2,300 years after Polybius described it. Schlieffen's argument was explicit and documented. He taught that Hannibal's geometry was not a historical artifact, but a universal principle. A battle of annihilation can be carried out today according to the same plan devised by Hannibal in long-forgotten times. The enemy front is not the goal of the principal attack. The mass of the troops and the reserves should not be concentrated against the enemy front. The essential is that the flanks be crushed. His World War I strategic plan, the Schlieffen Plan, now synonymous with the German invasion of Belgium in 1914, was explicitly designed as a modern Cannae on a continental scale. A massive wheeling movement through Belgium to encircle French forces against their own German border, as Hasdrubal had encircled Roman infantry against their own frontline troops. The plan was modified by Schlieffen's successor, Helmuth von Moltke, and failed to achieve the decisive encirclement Schlieffen had envisioned. What followed was 4 years of trench warfare, the antithesis of everything Cannae represented. The obsession did not die with the Schlieffen Plan's failure. In 1941, Erwin Rommel, pursuing the British Army across North Africa, wrote in his diary, "A new Cannae is being prepared." Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's armored doctrine, conceptualized his panzer divisions as motorized equivalents of Hasdrubal's cavalry, forces capable of the decisive sweep around and behind an enemy formation. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was designed as a gigantic Cannae, a double envelopment of the Soviet Kursk salient by the Wehrmacht's armored forces. War History Online's analysis notes the outcome with characteristic precision. The German army, having been bled white by the dream of Schlieffen's perfect battle of annihilation, Kursk marked the last time the Wehrmacht was able to mount offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, who had also studied Cannae, had prepared a defense specifically designed to deny the encirclement, absorbing the German assault in depth rather than presenting the kind of compressed formation that made encirclement lethal. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in World War II, formulated his own assessment in writing. Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. So far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae. The quote is documented and widely cited. Frederick the Great and Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, in earlier centuries, had attempted their own Cannaes. The notion that an entire army could be encircled and annihilated in a single engagement became, as Wikipedia's summary records, a fascination among Western generals for centuries. War on the Rocks 2025 analysis draws the necessary conclusion. Cannae's tactical lesson transferred, its strategic lesson did not. Hannibal's tactical victory at Cannae did not yield strategic success. The battle was over in an afternoon. The war lasted 16 more years and ended with Hannibal defeated at Zama. Every general who studied Cannae and attempted to replicate it faced the same problem. The model required a specific combination of elements: disciplined infantry willing to trade ground without routing, cavalry capable of the crossfield ride with the self-control not to pursue, an enemy committed enough to advance into the pocket rather than withdraw, that could not be assembled on demand. And every enemy who had also studied Cannae was looking for the trap before it closed. The battle that Hannibal executed in one afternoon has been diagrammed, translated, debated, attempted, and failed at by the major militaries of the Western world across 22 centuries. The lesson is not in the tactics. It is in the gap between tactical mastery and strategic result. The gap that Maharbal, or Livy's version of Maharbal, identified from the inside, and that military historians have been arguing about ever since. We began with men dying from the press of their own bodies, not from Carthaginian weapons, from the formation their own general had ordered, which Hannibal had specifically designed their own tactical doctrine to create. That is what made Cannae different from every battle before it, and what has made it unrepeatable for every general who tried afterward. The weapon was not Hannibal's army. It was Rome's. Polybius records, and the weight of modern scholarship accepts, somewhere between 47,000 and 70,000 Romans dead by nightfall on August 2nd, 216 BC. The exact figure will never be known. The primary sources disagree. The physical evidence is buried beneath 2 millennia of Italian agriculture. And the Carthaginian perspective on their own greatest victory was largely destroyed when Rome razed Carthage in 146 BC. What is not in dispute is the scale. 20% of Rome's fighting-age men, by Britannica's estimate, dead in a single afternoon on a field barely a mile wide. Hannibal won the battle. He lost the war. The decision not to march on Rome, whether Maharbal challenged it in a conversation that Polybius doesn't record, or whether Hannibal made it alone in the aftermath of the killing, proved to be the strategic fulcrum on which the entire Second Punic War eventually turned. Rome did not surrender, did not negotiate, did not allow itself to process the catastrophe as final. It banned the word peace and enrolled slaves as soldiers, and thanked a consul for surviving. That institutional stubbornness, not any tactical innovation, was what defeated Hannibal's strategy. The men stripped of their civil rights and exiled to Sicily for surviving Cannae were taken to Africa 16 years later by Scipio Africanus and used to defeat Hannibal at Zama. That circle is not narrative invention. It is the documented historical record. The disgraced survivors of Rome's worst defeat were present at Carthage's worst defeat, and the irony is clean enough to seem designed, though it was only the accumulation of contingency and institutional memory. Alfred von Schlieffen named his military doctrine after this battle. Eisenhower wrote that every commander seeks to replicate it. Rommel noted in his diary that a new Cannae was coming. None of them fully succeeded. Hannibal himself only managed it once. The archaeological park at Can della Battaglia, near Barletta in modern Puglia, holds a single commemorative column at its northwestern edge, overlooking the Ofanto River plain. The ancient Aufidus, its waters still moving eastward toward the Adriatic. The museum inside the park contains artifacts from the site's long habitation, ranging from prehistoric finds through medieval remnants. There are no monuments where the killing happened. The field that saw the worst single day in Western military history is farmland, growing whatever the season requires, tended by people who may or may not know what the soil beneath their feet once absorbed. Somewhere in that farmland, the geometry Hannibal designed is still legible if you know how to read the terrain. The narrow plain between the hills and the river, the flat ground where cavalry could sweep without obstruction, the space where 50,000 Romans discovered that the weapon pointed at them was themselves. 2,200 years of military thought has circled back to that afternoon, to that plain, to that single tactical decision not to pursue the right-wing cavalry, but to turn and ride across the field instead. The numbers said Rome would win. The geometry said otherwise. The argument about which one was right has been ongoing ever since, in every military academy that still puts Hannibal Barca on its reading list, which is most of them.